What is the solution to racial bigotry and police brutality in America? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy, especially within the context of the burning issues of the day. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, a principled libertarian who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
Yeah, and if you're new to the Future of Freedom Foundation, come and visit us at fff.org. We've got about 3 decades worth of principled arguments and positions and articles and conferences and other things on libertarianism. Subscribe to this YouTube channel. Richard, okay, one of the burning issues of our time, of course, is racism, racial bigotry. You just finished writing a very nice article analyzing especially the works of Thomas Sowell and also talking about Walter Williams, 2 African-American economists. And I've this week also addressed the racial bigotry in the context of the police brutality that afflicts people of color. So I thought we would kind of try to mesh these perspectives together if we can and come up with kind of a libertarian analysis of what's going on in this country. So I'll start out first, as I usually do, and then I'll pass the baton over to you. You know, we know that there's a lot of tyranny in this country. There's a lot of police brutality. It falls a lot on African Americans. And, you know, you see this tremendous reaction. I mean, there's always been this resistance. I mean, going back decades among people in the Black community against the police brutality. But all of a sudden, boy, it has just manifested itself. It's like one of those things where you just, the tinder is all there ready to ignite with just a spark. And that spark was the killing of George Floyd. And man, you've got these massive protests and massive anger. Now, my thesis is this, that the principal cause of the problem here is the drug war. This is a government program that's been going on for decades. It's a failed program. It's a destructive program, and it's brought into existence the drug lords and the drug gangs and the cartels and the violence and the corruption. There's nothing positive that can be said about the drug war. And it has fallen on people of all races, colors, creeds, national origins. I mean, it falls on everybody. There's no question about it. But there's also no question that it falls disproportionately on African Americans, especially with respect to the long jail sentences and the pat-down searches, the humiliation that takes place of just stopping a black whenever a police officer wants to, whether he's walking down the street or driving his car. And the problem here is that the drug, we know that there's racial bigotry in American society, okay? That's a given. You're never going to get rid of it. I mean, this idea that we're going to get rid of racism is just a pipe dream. But when it's in the private sector, there are limitations. I mean, people, you know, they're subject to criticism, they're subject to social ostracism, economic boycotts. And so people have to weigh the costs of being a bigot. And if they're willing to bear those costs, well, they're able to do that. The problem is that when you've got a government program like the drug war, it serves as a magnet for these police departments, where the magnet draws in the racial bigot, who now is able to exercise his bigotry to his heart's content, and even get praised and thanked and glorified and honored for it, because he's trying to rid America of drugs, and he's going to win the war on drugs. And so the police departments, they pull in these kind of people, they attract these kind of people, and these people exercise their bigotry in very brutal ways, you know, just stopping a black walking down the street whenever they want, or framing them, planting drugs on them, pat down searches, humiliating, demeaning interrogations. If they don't answer correctly, they get dragged out of their car, they arrested, charged with resisting arrest. And then when it goes to trial, of course, the prosecutors always say, well, who are you going to believe? This upstanding police officer who's trying to rid our society of illicit drugs, or this defendant here who has a motive to lie? And of course, a classic example of the frame-up was Talia, Texas, where this white decorated police officer framed dozens of people in the community, blacks. And they've sent them up for high jail sentences. They were all saying they were innocent. And as it turned out, after they got these long jail sentences, and some of them were already in jail, it was discovered that the police officer had just made the whole thing up. So my thesis is very simple, that if you get rid of the drug war, you get rid of a lot of the problem of police brutality in this country. If you limit the police to what they're supposed to be doing, get them out of vice entirely, limit them to just going after murderers, rapists, thieves, robbers, then all of a sudden you don't have the big opportunity to exercise bigotry against blacks. Now, that's not to say that there still won't be some bigotry taking place, but the opportunity to do so will be extremely limited. You don't have the no-knock searches anymore, the no-knock raids on homes where they can go in the middle of the night and attack blacks. They lose the principal excuse, justification for the exercise of their bigotry. And so the magnet goes away. And at that point, the racial bigots in the police department start to drift away. Now, I'm not suggesting that every policeman's a bigot any more than every judge is a bigot. We all know that would be ridiculous. What I'm suggesting is that there are racial bigots in the judiciary and in the police departments, and the principal cause of that is this magnet of the drug war. Let's get rid of the drug war and let's see what happens. I say that at that point, the problem we face with police brutality against everybody, but especially against blacks and Hispanic Americans and so forth, would essentially disintegrate. Now, to buttress my point, you'll recall there was a guy named David Simon, or is a guy named David Simon, who produced this great series called The Wire, which was about police activity in Baltimore. And it showed the corruption and the brutality of the drug war. Well, Simon went on an interview on CNN just in the last week with Christiane Amanpour, where she asked him, well, what do you think about the police brutality? What should we do about it? And Simon was very clear. He says, just get rid of the drug war. So all you got to do is just get rid of this drug war, and most of your problem is alleviated. Well, she didn't pursue that. She kept saying, well, yeah, but what about this and what about that? She did not take the opportunity ever to delve into, well, why is this, Mr. Simon? Why do you say this? And what would be the ramifications of legalizing drugs? And how would we accomplish that? Everything was oriented toward, well, let's just assume that the drug war continues. What are you going to do about the problem? And to Simon's everlasting credit, he just kept repeating the same point. He'd say, well, my answer is going to be the same to you, essentially on every question. Get rid of the drug war. That's the solution here. And that's what my argument is, Richard. Let's get rid of the drug war and let's just see what happens. My prediction is that all this police brutality, demeaning, humiliation would tend to disintegrate, and then we get this country back on the right track. What do you think?
Well, I agree totally about the drug war. I've just sort of highlighter sort of pan back further, and that is that what is the general problem of which the drug war is an essential element, and that is the government interventionist state. Once the government has the power, authority, and the legitimacy to intervene into the social and economic affairs of the citizenry and use its power to prohibit, subsidize, control, privilege, burden through either taxes or licensing rules or regulations or prohibitions, as in the drug case, you inevitably set up a political situation in which there is absolutely nothing that the government can do that does, through these regulations, controls, restrictions, prohibitions, subsidies, etc., inherently privilege certain groups in the society and unprivilege or burden others. Ludwig von Mises, the famous Austrian economist, of course, came from Europe during the war years of the Second World War to the United States. But if you read some of his essays from when he was in Europe in the 1920s and the 1930s, he hammered away at the ability of the interventionists, the regulatory state, to be used in countries in Central and Eastern Europe where there were mixed populations, a majority ethnic or linguistic group, and one or more small linguistic or ethnic minority groups, and how prejudice, bigotry, and the desire to enviously suppress someone who may be an undesired rival or competitor for the larger group, to use the power of the state, to use the regulations, the controls, the restrictions, the licensing requirements, to harm and do damage to the ethnic or linguistic minority to the benefit of those in the larger group. That is the nature of the state. So if we want to see a diminishment of politicized racism that is state-sponsored and facilitating racial and racist actions, we need to diminish, in general, the core element program, obviously, is the war on drugs. But we have to sort of pull back more generally to depoliticize human relationships. Now, let me sort of extend that a little bit further. What the hell am I talking about when I say that? In the marketplace, human relationships are based upon peaceful, voluntary consent and association. No one can prohibit me from having some type of association or market exchange or arrangement with Jacob Hornberger. Others may not like that I'm dealing with him. Others may wish that he wasn't there to give me a better offer in the marketplace than they could give me in comparison to Jacob Hornberger. But the state cannot be used to prohibit, restrict, prevent, or punish or penalize either Jacob Hornberger from offering me a better deal than someone else, or me choosing freely to accept his as opposed to the others. That basically means that people cannot be targeted. Minority groups cannot be targeted. Now, you had mentioned that I wrote this week, my weekly article, the fact that a commemorative piece, if you will, the fact that this month, June 30th, is the 90th birthday of the famous free market economist, Thomas Sowell, who by ancestry happens to be African American. He's devoted a large part of his writings to these issues of race and discrimination, both in the United States and around the world. 24 books, at least, and numerous articles, and devoting many of when he used to have it, his regular weekly column in newspapers to this issue. And what he basically showed is that if you look anywhere around the world, there are sometimes very successful, entrepreneurial, hardworking minorities, and members of the majority population will use the power of the state, whether it be in Malaysia, where the majority Malaysians are persecuted and discriminated against an ethnic minority of Chinese, or the Tamil in Ceylon, or I was once in Fiji, the Fiji Islands, actually a couple of times, giving lectures at a conference there. And there is the Fijian Polynesians, who are majority, and then there's a small but significant Indian origin minority, that is from India. They came there during the British colonial period. Now, the Indians tend to be hardworking, entrepreneurial, industrious, the middle class businessmen, entrepreneurs. They supply everything that we call market opportunities. To be honest, the Fijians culturally are far more laid back, less industrious, sort of like a leave it off until tomorrow attitude. Now that means that this minority of Indians are very successful, prosperous, wealthy in comparison to their Fijian Polynesian neighbors. So what do the Fijians do besides having regulatory restrictions saying you can only trade or operate in these areas but not others? They rampage periodically through the Indian community, destroying shops, burning homes. Now, this is all cutting off your nose to spite your face, is it not, Jacob? These are the people who are supplying you the goods and services every day. And because you're envious the fact that you don't seem to be able to compete as effectively in those lines of life as they, you destroy them. Well, that makes you poorer. It destroys the conveniences and amenities of your own life. But that shows what envy can do. It's the ability to use the state in these ways. Now, you were saying there'll always be prejudices, Listen, there were stupid people 1,000 years ago. There's stupid people today. And if we haven't collided into the sun or killed ourselves in a nuclear war, there'll be stupid people 1,000 years from now. But what the market does is it, as you were suggesting, imposes costs on those who choose to allow certain discriminatory biases to influence their decisions. Oh, you're a purple person. I don't like purple people, so I'm not going to hire you. In a free society, you can do that. But what is the cost? Well, a purple person looks around for an alternative employment. And there's going to be some alternative employer who says, you know what, I'm only concerned with one color, the color of my customer's money. And if the purple person is skilled, qualified, can do a good job at a salary that I can afford to pay him, I'm going to either not care that he's purple, or even if he's purple, I'm more concerned about maximizing my profit, and I'm going to hire the purple person. The person who says, I'm going to let him go or not hire him because of my prejudice against purple people, he loses customers, his profit margin is diminished, maybe he eventually goes out of business. So the market imposes penalties for allowing your prejudices and your bigotries to influence your decision making outside of the cost, benefit, and profitability of market-based decisions. Now, I just want to mention one other thing here. You know, beneath the skin, so to speak, we're all human beings. We think the same, we have logical minds, we have emotions, we have feelings, we have hopes, dreams, we imagine the future, we remember the past. We're all human beings. And in the market setting, where things cannot be prevented, prohibited, challenged, and people eventually start interacting, associating, working next to others, interacting in various social settings with others, and you talk to them, you get to know them. And guess what? You find out at the end of the day that they're pretty much just like yourself. They have families, they want the best for their children, they're thinking about tomorrow, they'd like to have a better house, they're concerned about, you know, putting some money aside for a rainy day. In other words, they're just like you. And that creates an arena of the marketplace that helps diminish racial attitudes so that hopefully we can be moving further and further in a society where, yeah, someone might say, you know, I like blondes more than redheads, but do you really make your decisions about a person, whether blonde or a redhead? Who cares? What we want is a society in which some people are white, some people are black, some people are brown, Asian. And guess what? It doesn't really matter. That's what the society of the marketplace helps to move us towards. The problem we have today, and it's exacerbating this problem of, you were saying, the war on drugs, is that we're returning to a tribalism in our society. Oh, are you black? Are you white? Are you Hispanic? Are you this? Are you that? And on this basis, we'll determine what your, quote, rights are and what your privileges are and what the state will give you as a benefit or a penalty. It is a return to a more primitive and group and therefore race-based potential society that will never alleviate these problems, which only a society of liberty based upon individuals and individualism, that who cares what a person looks like, as that phrase goes, which is becoming a cliche, but it's no less true. What is the content of your character, not the color of your skin? When we really have reached that point, and the market helps foster and cultivate that, we will be getting beyond race and racism. Just keep in mind, in the Old South, why did they have segregation laws? If whites and blacks wouldn't, quote, naturally interact in the marketplace, in social settings, in personal affairs, why would you need a segregation law? It had to prevent people from doing what comes naturally in their various aspects of life. And the same thing with the old South Africa. Why did you need apartheid? If you weren't afraid of a rival who might compete better than you, and you wanted to prevent people because of your own bigotry from interacting and associating in which they would have naturally, peacefully, and voluntarily chosen to, if not for your ability to influence the actions of the power of the state.
Yeah, when you were talking, I was thinking of an old segment of Star Trek, the original Star Trek, the real Star Trek, where Kirk is dealing with these two men from another planet that are each trying to kill each other. And they're both half black and half white. And they have a line drawn through the middle of them, and the left half, or one half, is black and the other half is white. And they hate each other. I mean, just absolutely hate each other. So, but it's not clear exactly what's going on here. And so finally, Captain Kirk gets to the bottom of it, and it's just racial bigotry. And the guy says, and Kirk asks one of them, if my memory serves me correctly, he says, "So why do you hate this guy? Why do y'all hate each other so much?" He says, "Well, can't you tell? Look at him." And Kirk says, "What are you talking about? You're both alike. You're half white and you're half black." And he says, "Oh, are you kidding me? The left side of him is white and the right side of him is black. With me, it's the exact opposite."
I remember that episode very well. And it was white and blue.
It was white and blue. Okay.
But it's the same thing.
Yeah, it's the same principle. Ridiculous. Now let me put things in a bigger context here too, because we know that the brutality of the cops is manifested not just against blacks. I mean, they bear a large portion of the discrimination they get from the bigoted cops, obviously. But the problem goes much larger than that. That when these cops stop white people too, they lord it over them. They're the masters, and that's the thing about the society in which we live, is that we really are the serfs. We are the servants, and government officials, including the cops, are the masters, and they act like the masters. You can see it in these protests when they stand up there in their SWAT uniforms and their military garb and their shields and all. It is clear that in their mind, they are the bosses. We are their servants. That's how they feel they can shove people, they can knock them down, they can bypass them even though they're hurt, they can kick them, they can tear gas them, they can do whatever they want because they're the masters. And it's not just a perception, it's reality, Richard. And it wasn't always like that in this country, though. If you go back to, let's say, the late 1800s, every American understood, including every government official understood, that the masters were the American people, the citizens, and the servants were the government officials. And they just understood that was the relationship of master and servant here. And so if a cop got out of line, there was like this shock, like, what are you doing? And it really goes back to Roman days where, to be a Roman citizen was just the greatest thing in the world. And servants, government officials knew you don't jack with a citizen. I think when they discovered that Peter in the Bible was a citizen, it was like, whoa, watch out. He's a citizen. You don't jack with him. And that was the mindset in the late 1800s. All that's turned upside down in the 20th century. With the adoption of the income tax, for example. Now, what's the income tax have to do with racial bigotry? And well, it has everything to do with master and servant. Before, people could be free to keep everything they earned. They were in control of their destiny. There was no mandatory charity like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Everything's turned upside down with the income tax and the welfare state, and the warfare state too. At that point, the citizen becomes the servant. The government's the master. We will determine how much of your income you're going to be permitted to keep, like an allowance, like to a kid. And we will force you to be good and caring to your parents with Social Security and Medicare, and to the poor with farm subsidies and education grants and so forth. We are now in charge. And so there's this relationship of master and servant. So when you're talking about a real, genuinely free society, one where the citizen's the servant, you're talking about a society where there's not this government intervention in economic activity, where people are free to engage in economic activity, pursue what they want to do in life, accumulate their wealth, manage their own lives. And in that process, you nudge people toward right behavior. You don't force them into right behavior. And you saw some of that taking place. For example, you still do, but if you take the early history of rock and roll, and I wrote an article about this back in 1991 called Racism, Bigotry, and Rock and Roll, or something like that, on the Future Freedom Foundation's website, where you had these groups that were integrating naturally. You had like Buddy Holly, and you can see it in the Buddy Holly story, the movie, where he's playing the Apollo Theater. He was the first white act to play the Apollo Theater, and then he's traveling with black groups, and there's white teenagers coming in, and they're going to concerts with blacks, and it was this type of integration that caused, and blacks were doing very well. There's that famous story of Madam Walker, for example, that I think it's on either Amazon Prime or YouTube, that has her biography. She's a black woman that became a multimillionaire after the Civil War, selling hair products for blacks. Well, this is what the market does. I mean, it enables people to pursue their dreams, and it enables people to integrate. This is what drove the bigots crazy. This is why, as you suggested, they needed segregation laws, because they saw that society was naturally integrating. And that's why they needed Jim Crow laws, because they saw that blacks were outcompeting whites. And so what we really need to do in this country is not just end the drug war. We need to do a complete reevaluation of where we are as a country and restore the founding concept of American citizens as the master and government officials as the servants, and make sure that everybody understands that that's the new relationship that would then be existing.
There's another element to this that perhaps we should take a moment to highlight, I would suggest. In all of these discussions in the media and watching it on television and so on, someone who has a concern about these issues might say, but what can I do personally? I would argue there's a lot that one person could do. Now, there was an individual who I know influenced you and me through his writings, and that was a man named Leonard E. Read, who founded the Foundation for Economic Education, FEE. Many of us grew up over the years reading FEE's monthly publication, The Freeman. And Leonard Read would often say, we all want to change the world. But how do you go about this? I mean, there's so many problems, there's so many issues, and there's so many people out there. What can I do? And Leonard Read would always say, well, ask yourself, out of all the people in the world, over whom do you have personally the most influence and ability to change things? The answer is yourself. Now, he, of course, was talking the broader issue of, how do you improve your own understanding and articulation of liberty in general, to try to then influence and persuade another person's mind and another person's mind. But let me suggest that besides talk, there's also action. And if a person believes in the principles of liberty and individualism, that a person should be judged as a distinct human being, his qualities, his characteristics, his abilities, his talents, his just virtuousness as a human being, then you can start by just evaluating and judging and interacting other people on that basis. Don't be prejudiced in that racial collectivist sense. Don't be bigoted in that racial collectivist sense. We all can make a step forward if we merely do one thing: practice what, as classical liberal libertarians, we say we preach. That is, it's individuals that matter, not tribes, collectives, or groups. That is, individuals who interact, and they should be evaluated and judged on their individual merits. Practice what we preach. And you know something? Slowly by slowly, one person, and then another person, and then another person. Every great social movement that has eventually influenced laws and politics and what governments do or not do have started out with individuals who persuaded enough others through the means of personal persuasion and example that it reaches a certain level of impact on the society that the institutional arrangements, sometimes for bad, but often sometimes for good, can be brought about a change. If we each just live these principles in our own lives and look beyond what a person looks like, but look at them as a person and act and interact with them in that way and set our own conduct and an example to others on that basis, at the end of the day, that is what will change society far more than a demonstration or a rally or a petition to a politician. I'm not saying that sometimes, the Constitution gives us that First Amendment right of freedom of association and peaceful assembly to express our grievances and concerns. I'm not downplaying that. That is part of being free people to associate in society, civil society. But ultimately, for that to be successful, we have to begin with that smallest of minorities, and that is each of ourselves as individual human beings in our conduct, and our attitudes towards others.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, Reed's emphasis on self-improvement as a way to change society was just so powerful. And it certainly had a strong impact on me. And just the waning moments here, Richard, I think it's worth mentioning another economist in addition to the one that you mentioned, Thomas Sowell. In your article, you also mentioned Walter Williams. And it's important that we just mention Walter, talk a little bit about Walter, because his book, The State Against Blacks, I mean, Walter's a black economist, libertarian, has long taught at George Mason University, for a long time served as chairman of the economics department there. And Walter's been heroic in terms of showing how the state has held blacks back. I mean, that's part of this concept of the whole welfare state, interventionist state, that the state has indoctrinated not just whites, but blacks too, into thinking, oh, we're here to help you. All this interventionism and welfare statism, it's here to help you. Well, Walter just pierced through all of this, just burst all this indoctrination asunder when he talked in terms of licensing laws that locked blacks out of the labor market in many professions, minimum wage laws that locked them out of the labor market as employees, high economic regulations that prevent poor people from starting businesses. I mean, just on and on. It's just a fantastic book, and along with a lot of his writings.
Yes, I have had the opportunity to interact many times with Walter Williams. As you were saying, he is a longtime economist at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. He's written serious books: The State Against Blacks, South Africa's War Against Capitalism, because he saw that capitalism was the way towards better social and racial relations. The South African government was prohibiting the market there. He's written about the extent to which there is general discrimination, and most specifically, how much discrimination would be in the society if not for the state intervention. And his column has influenced, he still writes his column about every week, massively touching upon these and many other issues. I personally consider Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell not just great black economists, that does not matter, but superb economists who apply the logic and reasoning of the economic point of view to cut through all of these absurd and counterproductive policies that they point out often influence in a negative way the life opportunities of those in black and other minority communities in the United States. And I mentioned this in the article in passing. If there was any justice in the world, Thomas Sowell, at 90 now, would have received long ago the Nobel Prize in Economics for his interdisciplinary and global-wide studies of race and relationships and the basis of discrimination in preventing people from having opportunities. That is the type of applied economics, if you will, that should certainly be worthy of Nobel Prize. But because he is obviously politically incorrect, he unfortunately will never receive that deserved honor.
Okay, on that great note, we'll wrap things up. Again, if you're new to the Future of Freedom Foundation, come and visit us at fff.org. Subscribe to our FFF Daily, the best libertarian daily commentary page on the internet. And also subscribe to our monthly journal, Future of Freedom. Subscribe to this YouTube channel. And Richard, as every week, I greatly enjoyed our conversation. I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time, and I'll just say thank you again to our viewers and listeners for sharing a moment of their time.